Okay, we're all set.
Great. My name is Rosen Jagulov. I teach in the Russian and Slavic department here, and I would really like to welcome all the physical and virtual audience members to the Jordan Center, because it's you're really in for a treat. It is my absolute pleasure to be introducing the one and only Ainsley Morse, a translator, scholar of poetry extraordinaire, and somebody I've been proud to call a friend for nearly 15 years, when I met during Ainsley's PhD studies at Harvard. Since then, she's taught at many places, especially Dartmouth, which she left for sunnier shores at UC San Diego, where she's an associate professor in the literature department. Ainsley translates from Russian, Ukrainian, and other languages, and the languages of former Yugoslavia. Her research focuses on the literature and culture of the post-Soviet period, particularly unofficial and underground poetry, as well as the avant-garde, children's literature, and contemporary poetry. Recent publications include the Yugoslav surrealist Marxist. The book is called Fine Feats of the Five Cockerel Gang, which she translated with Alexander Boshkovich in 2021. She translated also the Odessan poet Maria Galina's communiques with Anna Halberstadt. The book came out from Cicada Press in 2024. Then she also translated the novels of the early Leningrad modernist Konstantin Vaginov, with Jeff Cebula, coming out this year from New York Review of Books. She was poetry editor, poetry translations editor for Ukrainian Soviet modernism, texts and contexts, which she did with Galina Babak, Yulia Yuchuk, and Ustinov, also coming out this year.
Hopefully.
And is currently working on a collection of poems by Yan Satunovsky, who's the hero of our lecture today. Ainsley, as many of you know, is also the co-editor together with Nastya Osipova of Cicada Press, the only English language press dedicated to translation of Russian and Slavic literature and poetry.
Yes,
So-
that's true.
So with all this, I see the floor to you, Ainsley.
Thank you, Rosen. I'm so happy to be here, especially in person. I've never been in this room before. Or really, I guess, in a building of NYU, other than the library once. And thank you so much, Rosen, for the introduction and the invitation. So this talk is based on an article that I'm contributing to a special issue about Yan Satunovsky that will come out with Wiener Slavistischer Almanach, Vienna Slavic Almanac, that I'm co-editing with Yuba Goldberg. And so I'm very sad that she couldn't come last week. She got very, very sick. She's still sick. And because we were really gonna have April be the month of Satunovsky, because she was gonna talk about him a lot too. So I hope that this talk will serve to convince everyone to read and think about this remarkable poet. And you can read the issue when it comes out. It should be really fantastic. So Yan Satunovsky was born in 1913 in Ekaterinoslav, which later became Soviet Dnepropetrovsk and is now the Ukrainian city of Dnipro, in what was then the Pale of Settlement of the Russian Empire. Like many Soviet Jews of his and later generations, he grew up speaking primarily Russian. So this is a little hard to find out decisively, but the most decisive biography of him we have by Oleg Burkov says the family, almost no one in the family spoke Yiddish. While his family likewise did not speak Ukrainian, Satunovsky's youth coincided with the period of Ukrainianization, and he was familiar with the language and with contemporary literature. and he would later translate Ukrainian poems into Russian in the post-war period. Viktor Ivaniev refers to Satunovsky's first-hand familiarity with what he calls the Ukrainian, Polish, Yiddish language environment, asserting that this mix of idioms, words with ephemeral lifespans, and vernaculars would accompany him for his entire life. While Satunovsky's diverse ethnic, linguistic, and cultural heritage impacted his life in various ways, I'm going to be specifically identifying Satunovsky as a translingual poet, and examining multilingual and translingual aspects of his published work for children and unpublished work for adults, since his only published work was for children. In addition to illuminating the significance of the translingual for Satunovsky's poetics, I am also hoping to examine the place of multilingualism in 60s, 70s Soviet children's literature and why this phenomenon matters. So first, I'm going to try to make this case for Satunovsky as a translingual poet. So these languages that I laid out already of his childhood, Yiddish, a tiny bit of Hebrew maybe, and especially Ukrainian, appear occasionally in his adult poems. Further contact with German, Czech, Polish, and possibly French and English occurred during his years of fighting in the Second World War. To quote Ivaniev again, who points out to the inherent multilingualism of wartime experience. He describes Satunovsky's speaking voice as, quote, the vital and unitary eye of a contemplator isolated in his thoughts, whose hearing is crisscrossed by squadrons of prisoners of war and the speech of the great migration of peoples, end quote. As a freelance writer and translator living outside of Moscow in the post-war years, Satunovsky translated from Ukrainian, Czech, Polish, and other Slavic languages. So all of the 1,300 poems in Satunovsky's collected works have Russian as their base language. According to Eugene Ostashevsky, who is here, and whose writing about translingual poetry strongly informs this work, one way to think about the difference between multilingual and translingual poems is the extent to which the two or more languages are interacting with and coloring each other. For instance, nearly half of Satunovsky's children's books fall into what I'm calling the friendship of people genre. So these are collections of play and counting rhymes from various Soviet and non-Soviet peoples, which call attention to language and languages while not troubling the monolingual Russian paradigm. Most of these poems are multilingual. They include place and proper names and selected other words in languages other than Russian, but the foreign words are carefully boxed off and kept separate, serving as the linguistic equivalent of national costumes, but not impacting the socialist content or the deep structures of language. Even while it privileges linguistic and cultural difference, this kind of multilingualism, like monolingualism, implicitly supports translational equivalence and the idea that everything can be easily understood between all people. And I'm referring here in part to work by Yasmin Yildiz about the post-monolingual, moving beyond the mother tongue paradigm. Some of Satunovsky's children's poems, do I have a, no, I don't want to go there yet. Okay. Some of Satunovsky's children's poems, however, inch closer to the boundary of legibility and comprehensibility, and I will return to them shortly. So Satunovsky has some adult poems that are multilingual in this easily legible sense, including some early anti-Nazi poems that were published in the lead up to and during the Second World War in a newspaper that he contributed to. They were like in the humor section about Nazis. Actual translingualism is evident in other adult works by Satunovsky in that other languages interpolate Russian language texts in ways that are semantically significant. The form of these interpolations ranges widely, and the linguistic interpolations are not even necessarily non-Russian. So in this example, I think this example demonstrates the incorporation of dialects. So acknowledging non-standard, non-Moscow Russian. So I'll just read the Russian, I guess. Can you read? Is it close enough that you can read the English? Okay, it's not as most of the, so I've provided translations for all the poems, but most of them are not like translatable. So город Говорунов, Говорна-О, Горковские, Нижегородские, Корова, Творог, Корова, Творог. Говорят ака, говорят ока, говорят пока. Но от чего посущественно не говорят пока. So it's very, that's like kind of, that last line makes it very like the Moscow perspective, right? Satunovsky also pays attention to speech variations such as stuttering. This is a wartime poem from 1940, which also includes punning. It's highly characteristic that these two speech phenomena would be combined. So один сказал не больше и не меньше, как начался раздел Польши. Второй страстно захохотал, а третий головой помотал. Четвертый, заикаясь, преподнес. Раздел красотку и в постель нес. Так мы учились говорить о смерти. So this is like a crazy poem that there is a lot to say about, and I'm just going to scrape the surface of it because I'm interested in the stuttering and the punning. And so it in this way it highlights the abstraction of language with this pun, juxtaposing the division of Poland, раздел Польши, with the undressing of the pretty lady, раздел красотку. But it also models the breakdown of language per se through the stuttering fourth speaker who produces the pun with some difficulty, right? The final line, moreover, introduces the idea that while all the figures in the poem are evidently competent speakers of Russian, the war is requiring them to learn a different way of speaking that language, essentially a different language that they will all need to master in order to talk about or avoid talking about what they are witnessing. So even without the inclusion of non-Russian words, this heightened attention to the variations within one language serves to break down the illusion of neutral monolingualism. In recent work on translingual poetry, Zhenya has been pointing to punning as the premier device for translingual poetry, understood broadly as poetry that slows down perception and foregrounds thinking about language alongside whatever other messages it may be keen to convey. And you said something about how, like for the formalists, that was the definition of poetry per se. So the presence of other languages in a poem, even relatively comprehensible languages, has a defamiliarizing and thus destabilizing effect on the reader. So this, to bring the formalists in, recalls what Yuri Tanyanov said about Osip Mandelstam and his peculiar ability to make ordinary Russian words sound foreign. So to quote, this is from Pромежуток, this highly responsive verse culture needs only a small foreign implantation for ordinary Russian words like parting, разлука, long trest, простоволоса, wading, to become as Latinate as vigils, vigiliae, and for sciences, nauki, and pants, брюки, to become чебуреки, right? Tanyanov describes a process whereby the firm connection between the shape and sound of a word and its meaning becomes looser. While the futurists invented new words without fixed meanings, with Zaum, Mandelstam slightly destabilizes the meaning of apparently well-known words, bringing about остранение on the level of the individual word rather than phrase or image. Tanyanov thus characterizes Mandelstam's work as work on the literary language by a near foreigner. Many of Satunovsky's poems, although written entirely in Russian, perform a distinctive distancing of the self from Russianness. So in this one, he says, Дома не дома, сонный щебет стен соломой, как я хотел раствориться в России, не растворила. So this is continuing this idea of the near foreigner, right? Another poem addresses the everyday racism and discrimination toward non-Russian Soviet minorities. It is written in Russian, but begins by asserting the difference between us and them in all caps. So, их понятие. Еврей – это оскорбительно, поэтому говорят еврейчик. Армяшка, хохлушка, чучмек, дружба народа. While you could read the there in the previous poem as critical of officially sanctioned Soviet bigotry, Satunovsky also makes a more explicitly language-related critique, as in the following poem that problematizes the great Russian language as the medium for Soviet poetry and the Soviet state. Это видимость смысла в стихах современных советских поэтов свойство синтаксиса. Свойство великого русского языка управлять государством. И ты, не валяй дурака, пока цел, помни об этом. Here, the speaker, and evidently his addressee, or the addressee being himself, right, are pointedly left outside the bounds of all of the entities that are named. The great Russian language, its syntax, and capacity for running the state, and its status as the medium for the apparently meaningful content of contemporary Soviet poetry. Of course, the most obvious instances of translingualism in Satunovsky's work are poems that engage actively with words and phrases from other non-Russian languages. While the examples I have given thus far use Russian to spell out more and less explicitly his status as a linguistic and social outsider, some of his translingual adult poems allow a few select words or phrases in non-Russian languages to enact that distance implicitly. And I'll give some examples of that a little bit later. This apparent meaning or the illusion of meaning poem points toward the idea that Satunovsky's translingualism is also connected to his status as an unofficial poet. Mikhail Pavlovets, who's also writing for this special issue we're doing, he identifies a direct connection between Satunovsky's Jewish and Ukrainian identity in the Soviet context and his status as an unofficial writer. He writes, quote, "We recall that Satunovsky's complicated ethnic self-identification as someone born in Ekaterinoslav included not only Russianness and Jewishness, but also Ukrainianness. And the two latter identities serve as a sort of metaphor for his semi-legal position in Russian literature," end quote. While officially published poets of the late Soviet period were mostly bound to support the Russocentric monolingual paradigm, something reflected quite consistently in Satunovsky's children's books, as we will see, Satunovsky's unpublished status arguably released him from this obligation and encouraged him to experiment with a translingualism that embraces a degree of illegibility, one that points toward the freestanding idiosyncratic existence of other languages within and without the poet, while questioning the possibility of, again, translational equivalence. I would go so far to say, I do say, that Satunovsky's translingualism almost always has a culturally, politically, and literarily subversive function. Okay, so like his fellow unofficial Lianozovo poets, including Igor Polin, Genrikh Savgir, Vsevolod Nekrasov, Avsey Dris, Satunovsky made part of his living as a children's writer and translator, as well as a literary critic writing about children's poetry. He published at least 14 children's books under his own name, in addition to numerous publications in anthologies and periodicals. Many of Satunovsky's children's books are multilingual, if not translingual. In the late 1930s, Satunovsky had written occasional verse and humorous vignettes for this daily newspaper, Zvezda in Dnepropetrovsk. That I mentioned it already. It was a section called "В шутку и всерьез," kidding, not kidding. These columns and the children's books were the only Soviet publications that he saw during his lifetime, although he did try to get into print. In addition to the children's poetry, in the 60s and 70s, he published a couple essays in professional journals, mostly about children's literature. So to go back to the poem about their concepts, их понятия, many of these children's books actually are, in a more acceptable way, fall into this friendship of people's genre. In accordance with nationalities policy, different nations are identified by a limited selection of specific features. While the charming local features should ideally include a national language, by the late 1930s, the subordination of all of them to Russian was basically enshrined in the law. So in 1971, in this collection that you can see on the side, У Медведева Бару offers a neat distillation of this attitude toward nationalities. In it, different peoples of the Russian Soviet Republic are represented by a short description of a locally popular game, like tag or blind man's bluff, as well as a brief rhyme. And the rhyme is not a translation of some kind of folk song or play rhyme. It's an original work offering a summary of like what you need to know about the given culture. As Terry Martin puts it in his book about nationalities policy, a highly cliched essentializing rhetoric of national character. To take one typical example, the rhyme for the Bashkir game focuses on the name of the region's capital city, Ishimbai, its primary export product, petroleum, the name of a major Muslim holiday, Bayram, and an important cultural figure, the bard Buranbai. For good measure, some common proper names in Bashkir, Yamilya, Kamilya, Bibinbur, Fazilya, are thrown in. So, что под нами, под ногами, под железными столбами? Это нефть под Ишимбаем, это мы по ней шагаем. Емелья, Камилья, Бибинбор, и Фазилья, и Барань, и Буранбай, прилетайте в Ишимбай. So meanwhile, even this superficial degree of national specificity is unusual for the book. In most of the poems, various other peoples are represented at best by a reference to a regional capital, like of Mordovia, Komi, Kalmykia, Chuvashia, or even just the name of a river, as in this Udmurt rhyme. These are words you might look up on a map rather even than in a dictionary. Other nationalities get no specific features at all. In the rhyme for Chechnya and Ingushetia, in place of national specificity, there is some monolingual Russian sound play. The poem's characters have names that evoke the standard openings for fairy tales. Once upon a time, Жил да был, and upon a time once, Был да жил. The repeating zh and u sounds are perhaps meant to vaguely evoke the sounds of Caucasian languages, or at least the stereotypical Russian perception of them, but the poem fails to engage with any cultural specificity at all. It says, жил на свете, жил да был, с был да жилом он дружил, жил да был, без был да жила, дня бы верно не прожил. Despite the book's apparent commitment to multiculturalism, most of the rhymes like this one implicitly support the monolingual Russian paradigm, with its ideal of linguistic purity. All told, in the 60s and 70s, Satunovsky published 5 of these Friendship of Nation books, some of them ranging quite widely internationally. There's another one. So in the 1974 book, Kravod, Circle Dance, also features a selection of peoples of the USSR. While the emphasis here is the same as in the other books, the Latvian poem diverges with some actual literary code switching. So, U dorogi darks darks, storож strogi sarks sarks, zaperon varota varte, как попасть нам к тете Марте. So this poem includes the Latvian words for road, guard, and gate, placing them in rhyming position and without translation. Perhaps Satunovsky or his editors thought that their morphological and phonological similarity to the Russian words justified the absence of a gloss. But similar exercises are not done in poems that engage with languages like Ukrainian or Polish that are morphologically much closer to Russian. And the word Latvian does not even appear anywhere on the page. So this kind of counts as translingual. You know, if we have a definition here, since the interlocutors do not have the same repertoire of codes, nor do they display mastery over the code they do share, the chances for some misunderstanding and a lot of noise are high. This can be contrasted to the more explanatory Tajik poem in the same volume, which opens with a straightforward gloss. Поглядите, что за диво прилетело в наш кишлак. По-таджикски это диво называется ляк-ляк. Это аист, белый аист. So this is like a big contrast, right? The 1967 counting rhyme book, Раз, два, три, is like the Latvian poem bolder in its free incorporation of foreign words into the poems, although each poem is carefully entitled in French, in Turkish, and so on. All told, the book offers counting rhymes in 15 world languages, ranging from Bengali to Swedish. It helps that the non-Russian words are all numbers. Meanwhile, Satunovsky only uses the numbers that help him put together a rhyming poem. So the Vietnamese poem gives you the full range from 1 to 10, right? And you can see there's numbers like given there. But the Polish one, you don't get past 6. Because he wants he wants tratatai, teteria vrivitai, he can't go further and get his rhymes in or whatever. So although Russian remains the neutral base language, in some of the poems, a Zaum-like effect is achieved with unfamiliar abstract sounds overshadowing the usual banal situation of the poem, where you're drinking tea or playing. Many of the foreign number words constitute units of meaning or partial meaning in Russian, as in the first stanza of the Korean number poem, Il i sam na ужайке шумигам. A curious translingual Zaum effect is attained here, where the repeating first line seems almost meaningful, like because il i sam, like, should I do it myself? Or something, like this, it kind of sounds like something. Even while the title explains that this means just 1, 2, 3 in Korean. Satunovsky's engagement with counting rhymes and rather prolific work with them has a complex pedigree. On the one hand, several of the other Lianozovo poets played around with counting rhymes in a parodic vein connected to their often reluctant work in children's literature. But Satunovsky devoted several critical articles to counting rhymes, which he found fascinating both in and of themselves as children's folklore, for their connections to actual folklore, and for the free creative potential of their sound play. In the Soviet children's literature tradition, folkloric connections were prized for their authenticity, proximity to the people, and distance from undesirable children's production of a religious proselytizing or bourgeois imperialist nature. So Ekaterinoslav famously exhorted children's poets to learn from children, learn from other people, учиться у детей, учиться у народа, in his programmatic guide from 2 to 5. Satunovsky writes admiringly about Chukovsky's folkloric verse forms and seems intrigued by Chukovsky's at times controversial assertion that children liberate their song from the unnecessary weight of sense. Chukovsky had to go back and forth on that at different points in his remarkably long life. So books like Raz, Dva, Tri are emblematic of the confused late Soviet politics around nationalism and internationalism. Satunovsky offers counting rhymes with foreign content that could ostensibly broaden Soviet children's linguistic and cultural horizons on internationalist value, while the literature on counting rhymes emphasizes their connection to Russian or Slavic folklore. In one of his articles on counting rhymes, he writes, I had this thought, quote, after all, we remember poems without words, only the rhythm, and so on. No, we remember the rhythm and intonation of a poem we've heard, but have forgotten the words to, end quote. So seen in this light, the foreign words that Satunovsky inserts into these ethnic or foreign poems would seem to be properly read as almost entirely gobbledygook Zaum, rather than carrying semantic weight of their own. So it's clear that these Friendship of Peoples books adhere to the typical quota-driven production of Soviet children's literature. Meanwhile, the proportion they make up in Satunovsky's children's oeuvre, nearly half, seems worthy of notice. For the most part, in the children's poems, Satunovsky sticks with a superficial employment of foreign words and phrases that corresponds to correct superficial manifestations of national identity in the Soviet context. He has adult poems that incorporate foreign words in a similar way, like this poem, which I think of as late Soviet consumerist internationalism. Ел Yulia, pil bile, I bolel za filye. And I give you 2 versions because he has 2 versions, and in one it's Yel Filie, which is also, a foreign origin word, but, a little bit different direction. So in its taciturn adult way, this too is a Friendship of Peoples poem. But like the Latvian poem I referred to, it does not gloss its references, leaving readers to either know, which they probably know, like, yeah, or guess. If you can drink bilia, it might be biela, right? Of course, the letter E here, whereby Ukrainian is instantly visually distinguishable from Russian, would have been broadly legible to Soviet speakers of Russian. And the date probably helps as far as Pele is concerned. So similarly, albeit in a different emotional vein, this bitterly ironic poem, it's actually the second stanza of a two-stanza poem, uses German words and phrases, Fräulein, auf Wiedersehen, that would be familiar to most monolingual Russian readers in the post-war period and not require glossing. So, все дороги ведут в Москву, все народы по ним пойдут, изнасилованная фрейлин Ильза, auf Wiedersehen в социализме. As is usually, but not always the case, for Satunovsky, in these examples, as always in the children's poems, all the foreign words are transliterated and given in Cyrillic. The multilingual but not translingual nature of this last poem is furthermore clear in the requirement that readers understand the ironic reference made in the last line, see you in socialism, with socialism framed as an ideal location toward which all peoples are striving. The poem also acts out the fact that when all the peoples and all the roads lead to Moscow, it also means switching to Russian. This poem thus functions further as a wry affirmation of being stuck in the monolingual paradigm, even if the experience of the poem's victims is very far from that of the poem's author. Like many of his Lianozovo comrades, Satunovsky makes use of formal features of children's poetry in poems which are obviously written for adults in terms of theme. The following short poem from 1972 might at first glance resemble a children's poem with its repetitive address to a cute animal. It does not, however, use end rhyme, as you might expect in a children's poem, and its exhortations are ruefully adult. So, улитка, улитка, ховай свою душу. Не высовывай рожки, держи язык за зубами. The poem engages implicitly with the grown-up problem of linguistic politics. The verb chovать, which I've translated as tuck away, does appear in Russian dictionaries, but as a dialecticism. Here it is patently an assertion of the Ukrainian verb chovate, to hide. The location of the poem is furthermore given as Crimea. The grammatical and sound repetition of chovai vysovivai further emphasizes the political nature of the sentiments expressed by pairing the common phrase vysovivаться, don't stick your neck out, with the non-standard chovate. It draws a parallel between the need to stand with the radar and the use of non-standard, non-Russian or dialectal language. The poem's final line drives the point home with its reference to language, tongue, combined moreover into the standard expression for holding one's tongue, which is maybe especially conspicuous since snails don't have tongue. I gather.
Or teeth.
Or teeth. This poem is legible to monolingual Russian readers, particularly of Satunovsky's underground milieu, considering its themes of hiding and self-censorship, but its translingual gesture adds an additional layer of meaning for readers with access to multiple languages, or dialects, if you will. To further complicate things, the use of Ukrainian does not necessarily symbolize pro-Ukrainian sentiment, especially since the snail soul hiding collocation appears in another poem in an explicitly Jewish context. So he has a poem that has these lines: "В укрытие ушла сопливая улитка, еврейская душа." Satunovsky's interpolation of Ukrainian is one of the more significant instances of translingualism in his poetry, since it reflects both the dimension of the poet's linguistic reality and of Soviet linguistic politics. The relationship between Ukrainian and Russian is fundamentally different than that between Russian and, say, Bengali or English. I'm going to quote Zhenya again from your very recently published thing, quote, "Language choice is always itself an argument. Language choices lie at the intersection of the personal and the social, in that they emphasize power asymmetries among communities of speakers and foreground historical, cultural, and economic change," end quote. Satunovsky's pithy, hard to translate multilingual designation for Ukrainian, двоюродная мова родного языка. So the cousin language of my native tongue. Sounds almost like a gnomic distillation of Soviet nationalities policy into one phrase. This phrase constitutes the last line in a late poem from 1980. Satunovsky died in 82. that opens with the title of a classic late 19th century Ukrainian novel. I'm going to butcher this, but Хіба ревуть воли, як єсла повні. So do the oxen low when their mangers are full. By Panas Myrne and his brother Ivan Belik. In the English, the words translated from Ukrainian are, oh no, I screwed that up. I meant to have them in bold. Sorry about that. I made a reference earlier to the connection between Satunovsky's Jewish and Ukrainian identity vis-a-vis the great Russian literary and social context he ended up in, because he spent his post-war decades living outside of Moscow. This poem, meanwhile, asks quite sharply, which of the we might Satunovsky have in mind here when he says Myrne's novel is famous for its assertion of Ukrainian independence against Russian colonial/imperial power, but it also depicts the tragic decline of its characters in the face of that power, and their venal and occasionally anti-Semitic behavior. The final line of this poem, which explicitly discusses Ukrainian in relation to Russian, could suggest a reading sympathetic to Ukraine as a colonized nation. But in light of the Little Snail poem and many other poems that engage with Jewish identity, Satunovsky's we might also or be read as Jewish. And in Myrne's novel, Jews are the victims of cruel violence. The Ukrainian evoked in the final line could then be read as bringing up traumatic associations, but maybe since it's poetry and we like to think like this, maybe both of these readings are possible at the same time. As Satunovsky himself remarked, quote, I suppose writing poems in a slightly Rozanov style, roughly speaking, both for and against, that is one little poem for and another one against, is typical for me, but I'm not to blame. It just worked out like that, practically without my even wanting it. Satunovsky brings languages other than Ukrainian into his poems as well, particularly languages that he translated from, and from places where his army service took him during the war. Some of these translation poems are patently translingual in that they use other languages to think about the base language of Russian. This poem is from 1945. So it refers more to his recently completed army service than to his later work as a middle-aged translator. По-чешски жизнь жажда. Жажда быть так же естественно, как, скажем, пить. Пей, только без дешевых афоризмов. Ведь если на то пошло, так даже спать – это тоже жажда. Жажда вспять, смерть. А ты говорил, поговорим о жизни. Надо исходить из жизни. Взять пример. Жил и умер. Чехи говорят «земжил». Взял, допустим, и замжал. И фиг с ним. Like the children's poems, the first line glosses its foreign word, but this is not meant to answer a question as much as to pose one. Interpreting the Czech word жизнь, thirst, through its Russian homophone жизнь, Satunovsky plays around with the idea of an innate logic in language and across languages, which takes him in a wide circle through other phenomena understood as natural, including sleep and death. Acknowledging that this circle has led to a kind of armchair or really barstool philosophizing, the speaker concludes the first long stanza with the life, actually thirst, of the first line. In the short final stanza, the tone shifts with the life theme appearing in this sententious «надо исходить из жизни», which sounds like a commonplace of socialist realism or something. The formality is quickly dispelled with the no-nonsense and irreverent, for example, he lived and died, which brings Czech back in the past tense of to die. One more irreverent register lower, we get the translingual phrase up and died, взял и умер, взял и замжил. And the dismissive conclusion in Russian, rhyming with the life of the stanza's first line, fig s nim. Right. This highly translingual poem signals its interest in translation directly, but also models thinking about and between languages. This includes intralingual punning, like spать, вспять, as well as reflections of both connections and non-equivalents or false friends, like жизнь. So sorry, Zhenya, I just read your paper like right before I wrote this, so to quote you one last time. Since some things in the translingual text cannot be said in this language, but must be said in that language, rendering individual languages semantically finite, literary code switching resists and problematizes translation if it does not deny it outright. And since Satunovsky worked a lot as a translator, this is quite relevant for his later work as well. And also for my translation, which, you know, doesn't work. So this is the last, in conclusion, I'll just give one more example of that later, from that later work, translation work in the post-war period. So this is a poem from 1967, which is a time that, as we've seen, like he's really working a lot in the children's literature and as a translator. He has a whole cycle of these really charming poems about his grandson, Ilyusha. And they really, in my view, beg to be examined through a translingual lens, with a view to the different languages of children and adults, and their many points of mutual incomprehension, right? So maybe within one language even. So this one addresses that problem alongside problems of translation and translational equivalence. So внук. Он и по-польски внук, и по-чешски внук, и по-словенски, и по-болгарски. А, например, дисциплина, по-чешски казнь, по-польски карность. Внук, это тебе понятно? Да? Понятно? Тогда, пожалуйста, выплюнь пуговицу изо рта. So this poem begins by modeling a kind of friendship of these Slavic peoples. The same word in all these languages. All of the foreign words are glossed, with no demand that readers know any of the Slavic languages mentioned, Czech, Polish, Slovenian, Bulgarian. The poem then contrasts the harmlessly Latinate Russian word disciplina to the ominous sounding Czech kazin and Polish karność. Which evoke respectively in Russian the death penalty and divine punishment, right, with kara, or even just the punitive karatini, for a Russian listener. In this sense, the foreign words in the poem are only important insofar as they are misheard as words in Russian. They also serve to dissolve the fantasy of East European unity suggested in the first part with all of these vnuki. But the significance and potential threat of these insights are meanwhile soon dispelled by the fact that the infant addressee of the poem does not share in the sense of alarm. The grandfather's efforts to discipline him are hardly effective. The child's pre-verbal state is further emphasized by the fact that he has a button in his mouth and cannot participate in any linguistic games. Even the request for the grandson to literally spit it out sounds a bit like ironic commentary on the linguistic ruminations of the preceding stanzas. So despite the mostly monolingual Russian environment of his later years, Satunovsky was, until his dying day, a multilingual person. As a poet, he spent his life paying attention to language, as he writes, even in his short autobiographical note, "Poems are my life." It stands to reason that some of his poems would be translingual, drawing attention to and inspiration from the peculiar clashes and harmonies of different languages, as well as the meanings that emerge from the fact itself of the inclusion or incursion of different languages in a poem. Satunovsky's relationship to the multilingual Soviet project was ambivalent, a witness to the varied forms of state violence. He was clear-eyed about the limits of Soviet inclusivity vis-a-vis minorities like himself. Satunovsky's interpolations of non-Russian languages are often in a subversive and critical. Thank you.
Ainsley, this was really so fun and
I aim for fun.
Yes.
Yeah.
You succeeded. So we have two audiences, the physical one and the virtual one. So if the virtual one has questions, could it raise its virtual hand, and I will we would then facilitate the unmuting. But let us in the meantime start with the physical audience. and its questions, with Zhenyu multiply quoted.
Yeah, hero of the hour.
And then George.
Well, my question, basically, I mean, this is the question that I asked last night. Which has to do with the originality and uniqueness of his poetic form, especially in the 30s and the 40s and even the 50s. And whether the form itself, which is so anti-Russian in terms of poetics, can be regarded as in this context a translingual gesture, but as a kind of orientation towards the poetics of somebody else.
Yeah, so we did talk about that last night. I think yeah, I have a sort of a suspicion, a hopeful guess in response to that. So Satunovsky, as I said, he started writing, his first poems are dated to the late 1930s. And his early influences are overwhelmingly Mayakovsky, but that's like true for basically everybody. He studied in Moscow as a young man, and he was hanging out with the constructivists. And so those are the kind of Russian formative influences, and I think some of that is there for sure. And we talked a little bit about, again, this is less about form and more about like the language that he uses, which is very prosaic, conversational, which is not unheard of at the time, but also unusual. But formally, I have this idea that because of where he's from, and he does go back to Dnepropetrovsk after studying in Moscow, he's there for several years before the war starts, and he's called up. I have this idea that maybe he had some kind of contact with the Ukrainian Yiddish poets. Who moved to free verse way earlier and were doing this really interesting modernist stuff, and were in Ukraine before they were all killed, but were sort of in parallel to the really exciting stuff that was happening in Ukrainian poetry until the early 30s. So I have this idea that there might be something there, but it's been really hard to figure out because it's really not clear how much Yiddish he knew. And at the same time, like they were translating and having their work translated like into Ukrainian and into Russian. Like my colleague at UCSD, Amelia Glazer, was just writing about Yiddish translations of Ticina that like David Hofstein was doing like at this time, right? So even if he didn't have the Yiddish, he could have been seeing, but then it's also like, how are they translating it? Like, how much was the form being translated, or how much was it getting kind of Soviet adapted and becoming more rhymey and stuff like that? So I think there might be part of the answer there, but it certainly is an affirmative response to your question of, is there something translingual, maybe even about the form? I think yes. Because otherwise, even, when it's 20 years after he starts writing poems that he finds his way to Lianozovo and hooks up with people like Nekrasov who are doing kind of similar stuff formally. It's not the same, but it's radical. But for Nekrasov, that's something he started doing only in the mid to late 50s, and Satunovsky is doing it like in the late 30s. So
I mean, it's just really striking.
It's very striking.
Like the late 30s doing this.
Yeah. No, I've been trying to get to the bottom of that for a while, but it might take me longer, and I'd probably have to learn Yiddish, which I really want to do, but there's only so many hours in the day. Yeah, I think that George, and then
Yeah, I also had a formal question. So in terms of the children's books, are any of them organized sort of along a abecedarian logic? Is there an azbuka along with the karavot?
Not Satunovsky didn't do any azbuki. Some of the other guys did azbuki.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
No, but-
wondering, because it seems like the kind of, you have this, to some extent, choice where you cut, the counting, the sort of cardinal structure gives you, a formal direction there. Which, you know, a set of alphabets, causes problems, especially because everything is sort of, yeah, it's just. If he didn't write any, then he maybe was aware of this problem, but, would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar form, but I think it's telling that he's really into the counting rhymes because you can work with different languages
Yeah.
there, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I don't know if you, Alan Grossman has this thing about counting songs as a kind of a history of counting songs, and namely the idea of the way in which, you keep emphasizing rhythm. It seems to me like, just in the selections you read, there was this, seems to be a really hard emphasis on, eccentric syllabic verse, in those poems, particularly from the kind of what, but yeah, it's more of observation than a question. So sorry about that.
No, I mean, the Lianozovo guys, they almost all worked in children's literature. And some of that, there's a couple alphabet books that they do, and I think they're really into the way that it's, I don't know, combinatorial or something, you know, like you can, and obviously Krikov then takes that and runs with it. And the counting rhymes thing, to my knowledge, Sabgir, I think, does some stuff with counting rhymes. And he does a lot with math, actually, in his stuff for children. But otherwise, they like the counting rhyme form for their grown-up poems. And as far as Satunovsky has maybe, I know I can think of one off the top of my head where he uses the counting rhyme form. It's actually pretty gruesome. It's like about all the people who are killed, in an adult poem. But otherwise, it's not like he does so much with it in the children's books, but it's not something he's super attached to. And he's not that kind of a poet, like he doesn't do like Sabgir or Prigov where they get a form and then they just decide, I'm just gonna exhaust this form, right? He doesn't, he dabbles with, but for the most part, he's kind of got his quite idiosyncratic form that he sticks with, yeah.
That's great, thanks.
Yeah.
So this is a poet I've never heard of, so I feel almost like I've been introduced to a fictional environment, which adds another kind of beautiful, absurd layer to great presentation. I wanted to ask about collaboration and about audience with the children's books, especially. In part because the Mayakovsky that I was thinking of were the collaborations with Rodchenko and the kind of advertising ditties that are so much part of the image production. So when you were showing the pages of the children's books, I am wondering, you know, are the illustrations just kind of folded in afterwards and he was writing entirely, you know, on his own, and then later they were illustrated? How was that, you know, questions about production. And I also had questions about reception or implied reception of the kids' books, because it seems to me that one, as a child, one would read them very differently depending on one's more comfortable languages. So I just wanted to know your thoughts about, you know, if you're a multilingual kid or a monolingual kid, you know, is there any, the interpretation would be different depending on, you know, who's reading.
Yeah, that's almost like it's like a distribution question. So for the first one, my sense, so I've worked on Soviet children's literature. My sense with the Satunovsky children's books is that he did not participate in the illustration stuff at all. Like, I think he just turned in text and then they got some artists to illustrate them.
And was it consistent, or were there
No,
many different?
lots of different illustrators. Yeah, that's part of why I think that, because like, actually, again, some of the other Lianozovo poets, you know, their friends, fellow unofficial artists, were often the illustrators. And so some of them have like pretty productive collaborations that are interesting and quite subversive at times. like, Ilya Kabakov did a lot of children's book
Right.
illustrations. Holin worked with, Eric Bulatov and this other guy, Oleg Vasilyev. They have quite a few books that they did together. Pivovarov, so, and Satunovsky, none of his books are illustrated by those guys. Satunovsky is a different generation, right? Like, I mean, he met up with these people and they had an affinity for each other, but he was significantly older than them, and so he wasn't really a part of the scene in the same way. And he was also, he had a different, I don't know, like level of caution because of his age. Like, he was much more paranoid. Like there was a case where, oh my God, who was it? It was through Oscar Rabin, when Rabin was already the artist, when he was already living in France, and somehow they were going to publish some of Satunovsky's poems in like Continent or Echo or something, and Satunovsky was like, absolutely not. I don't want to miss that. Like that's, he was paranoid. And so I think that he was way more. I mean, even in like when people in the memoirs like write about him, they're like такой дядька Savoyskoy, like in his Sovietskaya kepka, in his плащ, like coming from his job at the plant. He was much more of a kind of, at least on the surface, ordinary Soviet guy, not a bohemian, who came together with all these younger bohemians on the level of poetics. But I feel like that also, like when he was turning in his manuscripts for the books, there you go, and then the illustrations, I don't think he was involved. So, and then about reception, that's something I've been interested in for a while with these Soviet children's books, and it's a little bit hard. Also, because like the print runs are huge. They're just always really big, and it wasn't because of popularity, right? Like it was just how they did things. But because of the Lianozovo crew, I mean, I guess he's probably about as like successful or prolific as a children's writer as Holin, so not like Sapir, who is, really appreciated and very well known. But he also wasn't like, there are other poets who had like 1 or 2 books total ever, right? Or just published in the children's journals. But he had a little era of children's books. I do think that mostly they were probably, I'm really curious about this question of distribution. Like you've made me think more about it. Like how, if the print runs were that big, does that mean that you could buy Satunovsky's Counting Rhymes like in Dushanbe? Right? I don't know. Like, yeah, I don't know. That would be a really interesting thing to try to find out about, because I sort of suspect maybe no, because of the fact that there were centers, like every Soviet capital had like a children's publishing house, and in the republics there was a certain amount of production in the local language, right? So in some ways, maybe it's not intended for the reading public of Dushanbe. It's more like the books I read as a kid about children like you all over the world, right? I mean, it's like the same kind of idea. Yeah, I think so. Interesting.
I have, sorry, unless other people have questions, I have one of my own, which is, I mean, to ask you about, and to contextualize this multilingual poetry practice, and to maybe identify several figures on whom Satunovsky possibly drew upon, whose use of multilingual poetry was important to him. I mean, we obviously have a huge spectrum from Mayakovsky's, many of Mayakovsky's travel poetry incorporates the foreign words in the languages of the countries he visited. On the dissident side of the spectrum, I mean, this is way after Satunovsky. I mean, we have somebody like Brodsky, with his on Ukrainian independence, where the use of Ukrainian is of course to to laugh
Mhm,
at it.
mhm,
So I'm just wondering about the overall context of multilingual poetry in the Soviet Union,
mhm.
and maybe some of the most relevant figures for Satunovsky.
That's a real great question. Yeah, so I feel like part of what I was trying to do in this talk is think through some of those contexts. Like, I think that the Ukrainian years are a crucial context just in terms of, so I guess I should back up and say that, Satunovsky, we've been talking about his poetics. And he has these kind of anti-poetics, right? Like, he's like, I am, this is sort of the poetry that is already there in language, which is something that Nekrasov talks about more explicitly, but Satunovsky, I told Zhenya yesterday, he has this one-line poem, главное иметь нахальство знать, что это стихи, right? So the main thing is, I say chutzpah, the main thing is to have the chutzpah to know that this is a poem, right? And that's the poem. And so that's why for me, the maybe multilingual, just social linguistic environment that was formative for him, it is one of the biggest, most important contexts, because it's like the language of everyday life. You want to interrupt me?
No.
The language of everyday life, in which there is so much poetry, and for people who are just from the get-go bilingual, Ukrainian people living in Ukraine, like that's life, right? And then I think, because I think that what Mayakovsky is doing is a lot more like what I was talking about in the children's poems, right? It's a little bit of local color. And like, especially in early Soviet poetry, there's a lot of playing around with French in that way, right? And then maybe a little bit with German, but it's emphasizing the foreignness as opposed to thinking about a multilingual environment that is normal, right? I think, yeah, so that's just an explanation of what I've done about it so far, but it's a great idea to look more into, I mean, there are more and more of these corpora of poetry, right? To try to really suss out who else, including among more official Soviet poets, who else is throwing in these, because like Yevtushenko does it kind of in a way like Brodsky, right? Or like Mayakovsky, right? Like kind of both at the same time, but it's just decoration, right? Yeah, I do want to hear what you want to say.
Well,
You had a
I'm
pressing
not sure I wanna hear what I wanna say. It's a very, no, I mean, it's a very difficult question to ask, because it presupposes a kind of reification that I don't wanna do. But the question is whether for some, I mean, first, so the Tinyana phrase about Mandelstam, right? I always wondered what it had to do with Mandelstam being Jewish. And also in this case, I'm wondering if we can talk about in terms of linguistic ideology, where we can talk about the precariousness of native language. Like the sense that, okay, my native language is Russian, but my mother's native language is Yiddish, right? Or in the case of immigration, I'm speaking, as a personal thing. My native language is Russian, my, grandmother's native language is Yiddish, my kid's native language is gonna be something else, right? Which is a very, very different relationship to a native language when you feel like your family's been connected to this language for, as long as it's been around, right? I mean, so the question is whether his self-positioning in Russian you know, has to do with his being from Dnepropetrovsk, has to do with his being Jewish. Whether there are all sorts of these,
Like contingencies.
yeah, and ambivalence is really in the sense of this is my native language, but it's not my native language. If that makes sense, but I really don't know how to ask that question. Because it's, look, he's somebody that definitely has had experience, because everybody's had that experience of hearing about poets in Russian, like Mandelstam, or, well, Brodsky later, you know, being called not Russian poets, right? I mean, this is something that happened quite regularly. So I'm wondering if there's that kind of linguistic ideology floating around, the precariousness.
I mean, I think that's why I started with those poems where he is very much positioning himself outside of Russian language,
Right.
even though he's writing the poems in Russian, right?
Right,
I mean, I think it's absolutely front and center for him. I think that there is an indication that, you know, Yan Ruski poet. There are like just straight up nowadays he could say "Я русофонный poet," you know, "Я российский poet," like that, like, but that's a very new thing, right? And I think so that's also why I think this, you know, I think he has, again, to emphasize a difference between him and this crew that he ends up with Lianozovo, right? Like, I think he has a kind of ironic distance from them, like, you know, I'm an unofficial poet, you know, меня не печатают, and he's like, меня до такой степени не печатают, right? Like you guys are right, and I mean, but you also reminded me when we were talking about this, that he's not the only person in that crew who has multiple marginalities attached to his identity, right? So maybe, I mean, most of them are Jewish, you know, Sabgir is Jewish, but he's also like kind of solid Moscow intelligentsia, right? And then there's Horin, who is like this prizornik, like weird guy who meets them because he just got out of prison, and was an orphan running around the Civil War period, right? And then obviously Idris, who keeps writing in Yiddish, and has some kind of a shady deal going with Sapir, where Sapir translates him, but really just like makes up whatever he wants. And I guess they both get paid. Like, yeah, so I mean, in that sense, he found his people, but in another generational sense, and a sense that has him coming from Dnipropetrovsk, right? Like, I think he is several degrees away from feeling, you know, and I think that he senses, I think he actually writes about that irony that here I am writing in Russian, because like, what else am I gonna write in? But I'm so not a Russian poet, and I never like, yeah. And then it's like, you know, it's not entirely clear to me the extent to which he wants to be one, right? That's another big question about, that has to do with marginality.
So I was wondering whether our virtual audience has questions.
Oh, my mom is in the chat.
So there is one. Thank you, Sasha. There's a question in the chat by Natalie. So Ainsley, could you tell us what is the difference between the poetic approach of Satunovsky and the Lianozovo group? Is there a semantic or aesthetic gap here that separates Satunovsky's poetry from the Lianozovo group?
I mean, like almost all groups, it's not really a group, right? Like they don't have a manifesto or anything, and most of them were very vehement in, especially the post-Soviet period, when called upon to reflect upon the existence of a group. Никакой группы не было, никакой школы не было, you know, and it's like the literary scholars think these things up after the fact. So I want to start with that. And I think it's also important to recognize that the loose circle of artists and writers who gather, not even in Lianozovo a lot of the time, but in Dolgoprudny, which just doesn't sound as nice or something, were really mostly visual artists. And then there's this small clump of poets who hang out there. So I feel like it almost doesn't matter like how much he differs or doesn't differ, because they all differ from each other. And I don't want to tell you things that you already know, but you know, Kholin and Sapir considered themselves disciples of Yevgeny Kropivnitsky, who is sort of the elder figure of the group, if there's a group. And then Nekrasov shows up with Alec Ginsberg starting in 1959. Satunovsky shows up right around the same time through a different pathway. And they all like what they're doing. Like they appreciate what each other, but I don't know how to do this grammatically. They like each other's work. But they also are kind of not even, it's never been entirely clear to me how much they could influence each other, because I mean, Kholin and Sapir are very self-consciously declare themselves to be disciples of Kropivnitsky. They admire his work. They, in their early poems, it really, you can see it, because Kropivnitsky is writing these almost like Nikolai Nekrasov type, gruesome portraits of life in these barracks. And Kholin's first book and Sapir's first work are doing that kind of stuff. But then they start doing different things. I think that of the Lianozovo poets, Nekrasov and Satunovsky have the most in common with one another. But they both arrive, when they get acquainted, they are very much doing what they're doing. Like there isn't really a lot of cross fertilization, I think. I think that what they are doing that is the most similar in poetry is working with what Nekrasov would have called живой язык, живая речь, and taking that as the material for poetry. So Nekrasov says of Satunovsky something like, I can't think of any other poet who is so good at like catching himself at poetry. Like, oops, it's a poem, right? So I think like that would be the strongest connection or affinity that I would point to within the Lianozovo group. But I think it's also important. It was important as a social scene. It was important as a community, and they supported each other. I suspect, I don't remember exactly. I think I have read about this, but I'm pretty sure that Satunovsky started writing children's books after he met those guys, and they had some of the connections with the children's publishers in that fall moment. Yeah.
Any last questions, virtual you? Well, we not really thank you, Ainsley. I'm sure there will be questions. Really fantastic.
Thank you to everybody on, I don't know where to look. Oh, okay. Thank you for the question, and thanks to everybody who was online.